Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 10-game slate on college basketball. It's a pretty uninspiring slate considering the amount of games with not a whole lot of value and a bunch of high-end priced players. That said, I do think we have a viability here. However, it's going to be hard to lock in all the big-time players that you want considering there's several, 10,000 plus players available on the slate. But with that said, let's get into this slate and tell you who I like here. I'm going to start with guards, then forwards, then I'm going to go into the cheap plays. I did it separate today because I don't think any of the cheap plays are must plays today, which is disappointing because typically we need to have a couple of those. And even on smaller slates, there's usually a couple that stand out. And I just didn't find that today when going through all these teams. With that said, we're going to start with Terrence Shannon for the Illinois Fighting Illini. He is averaging 32 fantasy points per game this season. He's had some 50 fantasy point games, so his floor is pretty good, or his ceiling is pretty high, but his floor is lower than we'd like, based compared to some of the other players in his price range. But he does have a bigger ceiling, so that does give him an advantage as well. And he's got a nice matchup here where he could pay off. He's also averaging 0.94 fantasy points per minute, which I do like. Then we're going to look at Drew Peterson for USC. He's had one game under 20 fantasy points all season long. Lots of games over 30 fantasy points as well. And 3 of the last 4 games against Arizona, he scored at least 19 fantasy points. He's only averaging 0.82 fantasy points per minute, but he's still viable on the slate because he's got nice upside in the matchup and because he's been playing well as of late. Then we'll look at Jalen Clark here for UCLA. Now, he's one of my favorite plays on the slate, but he's going to be somewhat hard to roster. Because he really doesn't have the big ceiling that we want him to have on this particular slate. But he's absolutely mashed on ASU last season for 37 fantasy points. And in his last 5 games, he's had a couple down games. So it is a little bit risky from that perspective. He's only had 1 game over 30 fantasy points the last 5 games. But overall, he's still got some good upside here. His last game, he had 39 fantasy points as well, which looks like maybe he's back on track. But he's still been kind of hit and miss lately, so he is a little bit of a concern. His points haven't been there, which his shooting has just been down for a few games there. Typically a good shooter, so if he can bounce back from last game, I think he can continue that in this one. He's got nice upside as well, just not quite as much as Shannon does, who I mentioned above, but he's still great on the slate. Now, one of my favorite plays on the slate is Craig Porter Jr. He's been hurt a couple games ago, but he's back. He played the last game really well, had 36 fantasy points, so he should be good to go here. His minutes have been a little bit all over the place with injuries and stuff like that, but overall, he's got nice upside here. I think he's underpriced for his potential in this game. He's been over 30 minutes in most games this year, 30 fantasy points in most games this year, with 4 exceptions, and he's got a really good upside here. Against Memphis last season, he had 34.5 fantasy points in a game, and I expect him to have a similar type potential in this one as well. And then we're going to look at Walton for Wichita State as well, another guard who is a little bit cheaper here, plays 30 minutes a game. Now, his fantasy points per minute is only 0.8, which is a little bit lower than I'd like, but he's had a few really good games and a few off games. Most games are over 20 fantasy points, though. And for this price point and not finding a whole lot of guys in his price range that are viable, he is one of the better options. And he's got some upside in this matchup as well. So then we're going to look at forwards. And we're going to start with Edey, who just has a tremendous amount of upside. He's a double-double machine. In fact, he hasn't missed out on double-double in over 10 straight games. He has no games under 30 fantasy points all season long. He has big-time upside. And his last 2 versus Minnesota, he had at least 36 fantasy points or more. Overall, just a great play, averaging 1.37 fantasy points per minute, which is best on the slate. I think he's really viable today. I would say that you want to use either him or Trace Jackson Davis today as your core start of your lineup. Either one, and they're only $400 difference. Now, Trace Jackson Davis, he doesn't get the double-doubles that Edey does, but in 4 of the last 5 games, he has had 49 or more points. 3 of the last 4 games, 49 or more points. And then 4 of the last 5 games against Illinois, he's had at least 31 fantasy points. And then this season he has missed a couple games, but he's only had 2 games under 30 fantasy points all year long. And he's had 3 straight double doubles, including those 49-point games I mentioned. So I think he's insanely useful on this particular slate. Now, I don't really see any way that you can put both these guys in the lineup together because there's just not a lot of guys under this 47,000 to roll out the rest of the lineup. So I think the best solution today is to kind of roll out a one or the other kind of situation here and then fill in from that point. Then we're going to look at Hunter Dickinson, who's also a really viable option on the slate. He also gets a lot of double-doubles. He's had 3 in the last 5 games. He has got some nice upside as well. He's had 3 of the last 5 games over 37 fantasy points, but he's had a few less than stellar games this season, which is probably why his price is significantly lower than Edie or Jackson Davis. But he's got some good upside here at a plus matchup where he's dominated last season for 43 and 54 fantasy points. If you want to stay away from Edie and Jackson Davis and want to save money, he's a good way to do it, though he's only averaging 1.05 fantasy points per minute compared to the 1.37 and 1.28 of those 2 guys. Then we're going to look at Braden Carlson for Utah. Now, I don't love this pick today, but he has a really good fantasy point per minute at 1.23, and he's had a couple games all season under 20 fantasy points, which isn't ideal, but obviously he starts and gets good minutes with 40 fantasy point upside. He's been inconsistent versus Washington in his career, Washington State rather, in his career, but he has the upside and he is getting a good fantasy points per minute situation. However, he does sometimes get limited due to fouls and other things like that. So do keep that in mind if you do choose to use him. Cliff Amoria, sorry for butchering your name, I don't know how to say it exactly. He's actually been pretty solid this season. He's had no games under 20 fantasy points all year long. He has some for games lately, but he's a double-double potential, and he has nice upside in the mid-40s. He is averaging 1.01 fantasy points per minute, and he's been playing a good over 30 minutes in most games as well, and his price is a little bit cheaper than some of the other options available, so he's a good viable pick on the slate. Then we're going to get in our cheap plays here. Now, I have 4 cheap plays that are under $6,000 to hopefully help you get your lineups out. Now, they're not super ideal, so just keep that in mind. So we're going to start with Noah Williams for Washington. He's averaging about 17 fantasy points per game this season. As you can see, he's had some ups and downs throughout the year, but he's just only played the last few games, and he is playing a good complement of minutes. Most games, he is starting as well, so he has some upside here, and his price is a little bit cheap for what his potential is, but he definitely has a low floor as well. So do keep that in mind. Then we're going to get Franklin for Memphis. Now, he's at $4,800. His minutes are very sporadic. He's a little bit risky here, but I'm just looking for guys that I feel like we can get 10 to 15 or maybe even 20 fantasy points from, and he's definitely capable of getting in that 10 to 15 range here. In fact, he's only had 1 game, which was the last one, where he didn't reach that. He is shooting the ball decent. He just doesn't get a ton of shots, and he definitely gets a couple steals, which helps. And some rebounds. So I think he's viable on the slate, especially as a guard. If you need a guard spot pick, he's not a bad option, but he's not somebody that's going to get you like a 25 or 30 fantasy point game. Then we'll look at Maywat Mag for Rugder. Sorry for if I'm butchering your name. I'm not sure how to say it. At $4,900, he's pretty reasonable. He's getting a decent amount of minutes most games. He is being hurt by some foul situations in some of these games, but he has, bigger upside than Franklin does, as I mentioned, or even Williams, as I mentioned just a minute ago. And he's at forward, so you can utilize him as well. However, he has some good upside here. His floor isn't quite as low as some of the other guys that I'm mentioning here in these bottom areas, but his minutes are a little bit of concern if he gets into foul trouble. So do keep that in mind, especially in a tougher opponent. And then we're going to look at I don't know how to say your name, Rooney. Ryuny for Oregon State. He's averaging actually 18 fantasy points per game this season, but the last few games he's really had a rough time with the minutes and stuff. And it's not really due to foul trouble. He's just not really he's not being super involved in the offense, which he was earlier in the season more. But I do think he's viable on the slate with the potential that, with his price being quite a bit lower, and he's still getting 15 to 20 minutes in most of these games, even if he's not playing as much. And he has some scoring potential and rebounding potential, as well as some steals and stuff like that. So I do think he's okay, but he is a little bit risky. He's probably the riskiest option on this list of guys that I've mentioned here. So with that said, guys, that's what I have for college basketball. Not an ideal slate by any stretch of imagination. Gonna be tougher, but overall, we have to make with what we get from the slate. So thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.